On June 11, 2026, Walmart Incorporated filed a Form 8K with the Securities and Exchange Commission announcing the permanent closure of all 44 of its Walmart and Sam's Club locations within the state of Oregon, effective in phased wind downs through the end of the third quarter. 35 years of continuous retail presence in the state gone. Approximately 9,800 Oregon associates, department managers, and store leaders receiving termination notices. And the state of Oregon just lost its single largest private employer, along with an estimated $1.2 billion in annual sales activity, and the only full-service retail option available to residents of several rural counties where the nearest alternative is now more than an hour away. Now, I have watched a lot of retailers move in my 95 years on this earth. I have watched chains open in places nobody believed could support them and close in places everyone assumed were permanent. I have watched the most stable consumer brands on this continent quietly reassess where they wanted to be 5 years from now and act on the answer. But what just happened between Walmart and the state of Oregon is something I want to walk you through carefully, because this is not a story about a retailer closing 44 doors. This is a story about a state that watched its retail economics deteriorate for a decade, listened to its own governor describe the deterioration in public remarks, and is now staring at 44 empty buildings from Ontario to Coos Bay, wondering what comes next, and wondering how families in towns like Hermiston and Roseburg are going to buy groceries at a price they can afford. And the people paying for those empty buildings are not executives in Bentonville. They are the 9,800 workers who showed up to those stores every morning, and the working families across rural Oregon who never had the option to drive somewhere else. I have been sitting in the same office in Omaha, Nebraska for over 50 years. Same desk, same chair, same view of a parking lot that has not changed in any meaningful way since the Ford administration. I drink about 5 cherry Cokes a day, and I buy them, as it happens, by the case. I still live in the house I bought in 1958 for $31,500. And every single morning I show up to that office because there is nothing on this earth I would rather be doing. People ask me all the time why I never moved Berkshire Hathaway to a coast, why I never chased Pacific Northwest scenery or California energy. And I always give them the same answer, because the business I was building did not care what zip code I was sitting in. The numbers worked in Omaha, so I stayed in Omaha. Walmart operated stores in Oregon for 35 years for exactly the same reason. The numbers worked, and then they stopped working. And the moment they stopped, the company did what any rational corporation does when the arithmetic changes. It followed the math. Now, let me tell you how a single 5 and dime store in Rogers, Arkansas in 1962 became the largest retailer and the largest private employer on the face of the earth. Walmart did not become Walmart by accident. It became Walmart by building the most ruthlessly efficient distribution and inventory system in the history of commerce, and by passing the savings from that system down to customers in the form of prices that nobody else could match. The company opened its first Oregon stores in 1991, expanded steadily through the following decades, and by 2026 operated 44 Walmart and Sam's Club locations across the state, employing approximately 9,800 people, which made it the single largest private sector employer in Oregon. The company generated, by the most credible industry estimates, roughly $1.2 billion in annual Oregon sales, and in at least 9 rural counties, it operated the only full-service general merchandise and grocery store within a reasonable driving distance for tens of thousands of residents. Walmart was not just a tenant in Oregon, it was a load-bearing pillar of the state's rural retail infrastructure and its low-income food access. And Oregon had 35 years to understand exactly what that footprint represented. Now I want you to pay close attention to what happened next, because this is where my partner Charlie Munger's most important lesson becomes impossible to ignore. Charlie used to say, "Show me the incentive, and I will show you the outcome." Always the incentives, not the intentions, not the corporate responsibility reports, not the speeches at retail conferences, the incentives. So let us look honestly at the incentive structure Oregon built for a high-volume, thin-margin retailer operating dozens of locations inside its borders over the last decade. And let me be clear at the outset. The people who built this structure were not bad people. They were responding to genuine concerns about wage stagnation in retail work, genuine concerns about the consolidation of retail power and its effect on small local businesses, genuine concerns about the cost of living for hourly workers, and genuine concerns about environmental and packaging waste. I understand every one of those impulses. The concerns were real, but over a period stretching from roughly 2017 through 2026, Oregon assembled a stack of conditions that, taken individually, each had a defensible rationale, and taken together produced a mathematical conclusion the legislature never quite stopped to calculate. There was the tiered minimum wage structure, which by 2026 had pushed the Portland Metro wage floor to $15.95 per hour with automatic inflation indexing. There was the state's corporate activity tax enacted in 2019, which imposed a tax on gross receipts rather than net profit, a structure that falls with particular weight on high-volume, low-margin businesses like grocery retail, where the difference between a 1.5% margin and a 2% margin determines whether a store survives. There was the expansion of the bottle redemption program, Senate Bill 582's producer responsibility framework for packaging, and the rise in commercial property and industrial energy costs. And then, in the early spring of 2026, came the fatal detail. The Oregon legislature passed an amendment expanding the corporate activity tax rate on gross receipts above $25 million for general merchandise retailers, raising the effective levy in a way that, for a thin-margin grocery operation, taxed revenue that in many stores exceeded the store's actual net profit. For Walmart's Oregon operations specifically, the company's internal analysis, later referenced in shareholder communications, estimated that the expanded gross receipts tax would push 31 of its 44 Oregon stores into negative net contribution, beginning with the 2027 fiscal year. Now, I want you to read that number the way the Walmart board read it in the spring of 2026. If you are sitting in Bentonville with a team of advisors, and Walmart Incorporated has approximately the largest and most sophisticated retail operations team in the world, you are looking at a tax structure that is calculated on gross receipts rather than profit in a business where your net margin is already among the thinnest in all of retail. A tax on revenue, not earnings, is a fundamentally different animal than an income tax, and every operator who has ever run a grocery store understands the difference in his bones. When the levy on what you sell exceeds what you actually keep, the store does not have a profitability problem. It has an existence problem. The math is not close. It is not even an interesting question. The window to act is not after the 2027 fiscal year begins. The window is now, while the wind down can be staged in an orderly fashion and the asset write-downs can be absorbed in a single reporting period. Clear incentives produce predictable behavior every single time. What followed was not a single corporate decision made in isolation. It was a bank run. I want you to hold that image because it is exactly right. When depositors believe a bank is about to fail, they do not wait politely for official confirmation. The ones who move first lose nothing. The ones who wait lose everything. So everyone moves first. That is the structure of what has been happening to Oregon retail for the better part of a decade. The largest consumer-facing employers in the state have been making the same simultaneous rational calculation Walmart just finalized, and they have been quietly closing locations, withdrawing forward commitments, and reallocating capital before the next regulatory window closes. And the Walmart announcement, when it came on June 11th, did not arrive alone. Walmart itself had closed 3 underperforming Portland area stores in 2016 and 2023 before this final decision. REI, the Pacific Northwest's own outdoor cooperative, closed its downtown Portland flagship in 2023, citing theft and operating conditions. Cracker Barrel exited the Oregon market. Albertsons and Safeway, operating under the same parent, closed multiple Oregon locations through 2024 and 2025. Rite Aid, which was founded with deep Pacific Northwest roots, contracted its Oregon footprint significantly through its bankruptcy proceedings. Bed Bath & Beyond's liquidation eliminated its Oregon presence entirely. Nordstrom, founded in neighboring Seattle, reduced its regional footprint. And now, the largest private employer in the entire state, after 35 years of continuous Oregon operation, has filed its 8K to close every Walmart and Sam's Club location in the state. And in my experience, the names you can confirm publicly in any retail contraction are rarely the complete list. The estimated aggregate loss to Oregon's retail tax base and employment base from confirmed major chain closures since 2020 is substantial, and the Walmart closure alone eliminates the single largest private payroll in the state. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 9,800 jobs in a single filing. That single figure exceeds the entire workforce of the 4 largest cities in Eastern Oregon combined. Now, I am going to tell you about the moment in this story that I find the most extraordinary. The moment that, to my mind, defines this entire situation better than any 8K filing or closure announcement possibly could. May 7th, 2026. The Oregon Business Council is hosting its annual Leadership Summit in Portland. Governor Tina Kotek takes the stage for a moderated conversation on the state's economic outlook. It is 35 days before Walmart's 8K is officially filed with the SEC. 35 days. And standing in front of an audience of business leaders, association representatives, and journalists in a venue specifically designed to host honest conversations about the state's competitive position, the governor of Oregon says, in her own words from the published account of the remarks, that the state must, and I am paraphrasing carefully from the reporting, reckon with the reality that a tax structured on gross receipts rather than profit places disproportionate strain on the high-volume, low-margin retailers that rural communities depend on most, and that Oregon, again paraphrasing the reporting directly, cannot afford to lose the stores that serve the people with the fewest alternatives. The sitting governor of Oregon on a public stage in Portland, 35 days before the largest single retail closure in the state's recent history was officially filed, describing with complete accuracy the precise mechanism of deterioration that was already executing while she stood there and spoke. I have been in business a long time. I have sat across the table from a lot of extraordinarily capable people, and I will tell you honestly, I cannot think of a parallel. A chief executive publicly and accurately describing the failure conditions of her own state's tax structure while the failure was already in motion, while the legislature she works with had just expanded the very provision that made it inevitable. That is not contradiction. That is a governing situation so thoroughly documented in real time that it almost defies analysis. Now step away from the executives in Bentonville entirely for a moment. My father, Howard Buffett, was a congressman from Nebraska and a deeply principled man who taught me that the measure of any economic policy is never what it promises on the day it is announced. It is what it delivers to ordinary people living inside it 10 years later. So let me tell you about Brenda Halverson. Brenda is 58 years old and has worked at the Walmart Supercenter in Hermiston in Umatilla County for 19 years. The last 11 of them as a customer service manager at the front of the store. She makes $19.40 an hour, has health benefits, and has built up a meaningful balance in the company's stock purchase and 401k programs. She lives with her husband, a retired Union Pacific Railroad worker on a fixed pension, in a manufactured home they own outright on the edge of town. The closure announcement gives Brenda and her co-workers 90 days of notice and a severance package that her store manager estimated would cover, on average, between 3 and 5 months of household expenses for the affected workers. But Brenda's problem is not only that she is losing her job, it is that the Hermiston Walmart is where she and most of her neighbors buy their groceries, their medications, their children's school clothes. The nearest comparable store after the closure will be more than 40 minutes away in Pendleton. And for the elderly and the carless residents of her county, that distance is not an inconvenience. It is a wall. The $1.2 billion in annual sales activity that Walmart generated in Oregon was not an abstraction to Brenda. It was both her livelihood and her community's access to affordable food. She did nothing to cause this. She had no seat at the table when the gross receipts tax was expanded. And the gap that the closure of 44 stores leaves does not quietly disappear when the doors are locked for the last time. It falls straight down onto the people who stayed, especially the ones with the fewest alternatives. In my experience, damage of this kind moves in distinct layers. One chain announces it is closing. The corporate parent surrenders 44 large format retail buildings back to landlords and local governments that must now find replacement tenants in a contracting rural retail market that has no comparable operators waiting in the wings. The cities and counties that hosted those stores lose, by reasonable projection, approximately $74 million in combined annual direct tax revenue, plus an estimated additional $48 million in indirect business activity from the local suppliers, the trucking contractors, the maintenance vendors, and the produce and dairy operations that orbited the Walmart supply chain inside Oregon. The towns that lose their only full-service store watch the surrounding small businesses, which had built their own foot traffic models around the Walmart anchor, begin to fail in sequence. The county food assistance programs, which had relied on the presence of an affordable grocer to make their benefit dollars stretch, face a sudden access crisis. The local school districts in those counties, funded in part through the affected property and business tax flows, begin quietly modeling budget reductions. That is 3 full levels of damage from a single retail closure. And in rural Oregon, it carries a 4th layer that the cities do not face, which is the simple physical loss of access to affordable food. Multiply that structure across 44 locations in 33 communities, and you begin to understand the actual magnitude of what has happened to rural Oregon. And Oregon is not running this experiment alone. That is the part I need you to hear clearly. Washington enacted its own business and occupation tax, which, like Oregon's corporate activity tax, is levied on gross receipts rather than net income, and has watched thin margin operators struggle under it for years. Minnesota expanded its tax burden on large retailers in 2024, and by the second quarter of 2026 was reporting accelerating closures of full-service grocery in its rural counties. Nevada's modified business tax structure has placed pressure on high-volume employers. New Mexico's gross receipts tax has long been cited by retailers as a structural disadvantage for low-margin operations in its rural communities. The same template, the same incentive structure, the same mathematically predictable outcome running on a slightly delayed timeline in each state. This is not 5 separate state-level stories. This is one national story about what happens when the incentive to close a thin margin store becomes structurally more powerful than the incentive to keep it open. And right now, that story is accelerating in ways the daily news cycle is not fully tracking. I have made a lot of investments over the course of 70 years of reading financial statements, and the single most important lesson I have learned across all of it is this: you cannot earn your way out of a structural mistake by hoping that the people most affected by it will not notice what you have done. They notice. They always notice. And the people who notice the hardest are not the executives in Bentonville who simply move their capital to a state where the arithmetic works. The people who notice the hardest are the ones in Hermiston and Coos Bay who now have to drive 40 minutes to buy groceries. They act, or rather they cannot act, without the means and the mobility that the executives possess. That is the cruelest part of this kind of mistake. The people with the most options leave first, and the people with the fewest options are left holding the consequences. Oregon is now attempting to figure out how to replace its single largest private employer and the only affordable grocer in 9 rural counties. The company that opened its first Oregon store in 1991 is reallocating its capital to states where a tax on revenue does not exceed the profit on a head of lettuce. Brenda Halverson is updating her resume for the first time in 19 years and trying to figure out where her neighbors will buy their food. The towns of eastern and coastal Oregon are modeling their 2027 budgets around a retail anchor that no longer exists. And the governor, who described the precise mechanism of this departure on a stage in Portland 35 days before the 8K was filed, is preparing her next budget address. I stayed in Omaha my entire life because Omaha never gave me a reason to leave. That is the only reason any person or any business stays anywhere. Not loyalty, not habit, not sentiment, the math. Change the math and you change the behavior every single time, without a single exception in the history of commerce. The money never sits still when you announce publicly where you intend to send it, and capital never stays in a place where a tax on what you sell exceeds the profit on what you keep. If you are watching this from a state where these conversations are just beginning, where the legislature is debating its own gross receipts tax or its own business and occupation levy or its own retail surcharge, you are not watching Oregon's problem from a safe distance. You are watching your own situation playing out one election cycle ahead of you. If you have seen the only store in your town close quietly, neighbors start driving an hour for groceries or job postings, simply stop appearing the way they once did, leave a comment below. Tell us what state you are in, what county you live in, what you are actually seeing on the ground. Subscribe to this channel because this story is nowhere near finished. The numbers are still moving, and wherever the numbers go, the story follows. They always do.